Hi there. So yeah, this is me. As you can tell, I've seen better days. I'm working for Opera Software as a web developer and a web evangelist, actually. Some people don't like the word evangelist. Well, in that case, you could just consider me a developer advocate, if you like that better. I'm really interested in open source software, programming, and web security in general, but my main programming languages are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and that's what this talk is going to be about. So the title is 10 Things I Didn't Know About HTML. I don't know about you guys, but maybe I can surprise you, because that's the goal here. Really, I have a couple of more than just 10 things I want to say, so this is probably a slightly more accurate title, because I'll be talking about CSS and JavaScript as well. And all these things have one thing in common, and that is that they surprised me when I finally did find out about them. So it's a collection of weird stuff that wasn't obvious to me when I started out with these languages. So first, I'd like to take you back to the 90s and to the glory days of HTML 3.2. Does anyone remember those days? Show of hands? Yeah, some people. Well, maybe some of you saw this excellent blog post by Zach Holman earlier this week. He wrote about some stuff that only 90s web developers will remember. And, you know, as you can see there, he's using the blink and the marquee elements in HTML. He's writing about using tables and one-by-one dimension pixel GIFs just to align things on your website correctly. But it's kind of crazy to think about that. But once upon a time, there was HTML, but there was no such thing as CSS yet. So we kind of didn't have a choice but to do that stuff. And then one thing that he didn't specifically talk about was the presentational HTML attributes that we had back then. So blink and marquee are presentational elements, of course. You shouldn't be using them nowadays anymore. We have CSS and JavaScript for that, but still, those are nasty effects that you never should use. But we also have presentational attributes, as you can see. And one of those is BG color. It's fairly straightforward. You know, you could set its value to pink, and then you get something like this. Yeah, so there's a list of colors that the browser will support. It's the same list of CSS colors that are available. And whenever you use such a color, the browser just uses that to render the background. It's fairly straightforward. That's what it says, right? Background color. You can also use hexadecimal notation for the colors. And those of you who saw Leah's talk earlier this morning know all the details about how this works. For example, the first 2 hexadecimal digits there, they determine the amount of red in the color. The other 2, CO, they determine the amount of green in the color. And then the final 2 hexadecimal digits, CMB, they determine the amount of blue in the color. So in this case, you end up with exactly the same pink color. I realize it looks maybe a little bit white through the projection, but oh well, just imagine it's pink. Now, the first thing that surprised me here is that in this case, you can get away with omitting the hash symbol in front there, and browsers just don't care about this. Then the second thing that surprised me is that this doesn't always work. There are exceptions, especially if you try to use the shorthand notation for colors. If you've used CSS before, you probably think that F3F always maps to FF33FF. But in this case, for the BG color attribute value, that is simply not the case. If you omit the hash symbol here, you end up with a completely different color. In this case, OF03OF, which is black instead of pink. Yeah. So it turns out that there's an algorithm that determines how browsers parse all these legacy color attribute values. And it only recently got standardized, actually, which is kind of funny because it only landed in HTML5. So even though these attributes are deprecated and invalid in HTML nowadays, it took us until HTML5 to actually standardize them, despite them being invalid, which is kind of cool. Now, the algorithm is, kind of verbose, so I will spare you the details here. But the main thing to remember here is that there are a bunch of rules. For example, if you use a value there that is not a recognized color value, like pink or red or green or blue, the browser will try to parse it anyway. And in that case, it will look at the string, the attribute value, and it will not ignore non-hexadecimal digits, but it will replace them with zeros. And sometimes this leads to funny effects. So if you're easily bored like me, what you can do is you can try a whole bunch of different words and other things and enter them at attribute values here and see which color they map to. So I found out this way that sick, for example, maps to green, which is weirdly appropriate. I also found out that if you try to value Mr. T, which is the actor who played B.A. Baracus in the A-Team, you get black. And not just any black, but the blackest black there is. Yeah. If you try Chuck Norris as a background color value, the browser will render the page using the blood of Chuck's enemies. It looks something like this. And really, all that's going on here is all the non-hexadecimal digits in the attribute value, they just get ignored and they get replaced with zeros. So that's why you get C, and then the rest of the steps of the algorithm truncate it and do some other stuff as well. I also found out that while crap is yellowish brown, an actual pile of poo is actually black in HTML, which is weird. I also tried to value code.io, the name of this conference, and I found out that the color is actually green, which matches the t-shirts that the staff are wearing. Yeah, I thought so. See, they did it on purpose. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering what your own name maps to, or maybe you have a word in your head that you'd like to find out which color it maps to in HTML. And to help you with that, I created a very simple tool. You can find the link here at the bottom. Let me just tweet the link as well, so you can all visit it if you want to, and try it out on your smartphone or laptop or whatever. Yeah, it's published, so the tweet is there. Anyway, I've made a quick screencast to show you how it works. You can just pretty much enter any value you want. I tried it with my name. My first name maps to red, as you can see. If I add a space and my last name, it's green. And then if I remove the space, it's blue. That's RGMB. I'm a color model, basically. Yeah. Like I said, I get bored easily. In a silly attempt to boost my street cred, I was talking about this the other day with some of the other speakers, and Andreas mentioned that, well, he discovered basically that you can just enter disco like 20 times or so. And for each disco you enter, the color will change. And then when you're done, yeah, well, the demo speaks for itself. You can just remove it and then add it back, and you have a free disco ball effect in your browser using legacy and invalid HTML color attributes. So let me know if you find some other funny, weird value or something like that. The tool is there. So valid and invalid HTML is the next thing I'd like to talk about. Because back when I started with web development, I was really obsessive about these things. And whenever I noticed that there was a validation error in my code, I felt really bad for myself. And I felt like I wasn't being a good web developer and I had to fix it no matter the cost. But later I found out that maybe that wasn't really the best idea. And I'll try to explain this now. So it turns out that there are 3 layers of conformance criteria that validators should check for. The first one is called the DTD, or the document type definition. And this is basically a file that lists all the elements that are supported in a language. And along with the elements, it also lists the attributes that match those elements, and also where in the document those elements are allowed to be used. So there's a DTD for XHTML1, there's a different DTD for HTML4, you get the idea. It's just a file. So using nothing but the DTD, if you were to build a validator, you would be able to tell that this is not actually valid HTML, because there's no way you're going to get a P element inside of the head and have it validate. Similarly, if you were trying to validate this HTML, the DTD-based validator would be able to tell you that it's invalid, because there is no kitchen sink element in HTML. We tried to get it in there, but we failed, alas. In this case, a lot of common typos, like if you make a small mistake typing an element name, they can already get detected just by using this first layer of conformance criteria. But there are some things that such a validator cannot detect, such as this, for example. This is a very subtle validation error. This is actually invalid HTML because the placeholder attributes can be used for inputs, but not for all input types. And input type date doesn't support the placeholder attribute. But a DTD-based validator would not be able to detect that because, as far as he's concerned, you're just using an input element, which is valid, a type attribute, and a placeholder attribute. And all of those separately are perfectly valid. Now, this is another example. Here we have a table with a different number, an unequal number of columns in each row. And that is also a validation error, but the validator would not be able to detect this. So this is a set of conformance criteria that cannot be checked by the DTD, but they can still be validated by a computer, and they can still be automated easily. However, you guessed it, there is a third layer of conformance criteria, and those are things that a computer cannot possibly reliably detect. And this includes things like checking if the alt attribute for images is being used correctly, or if the content for a time element actually represents a time as is required by the spec, or if the content for a block quote element is actually a real quote and not some random gibberish. There's no way a computer can accurately check that. Only a human being can check that. So what I learned over the years is that I shouldn't have been obsessing about HTML validation as much as I did. Because it's not the whole story, and it's okay to have a validation error in your code if you know why it's there and if you have a good reason for it. And probably the most common example of that is if you're using the XUA compatible meta tag to get Internet Explorer to render using its latest available rendering mode. That is very desirable behavior. But if you have this line of code in your HTML document and you validate it, most validators will tell you that it's actually invalid. But should you really care about that? I don't think so. So the main thing to remember here is that validators, automated validators, can only check 2 out of the 3 layers of conformance criteria for you, and the rest is still up to you. So just because you're using a validator doesn't mean that you can stop thinking about your markup. Then let's talk about character references or HTML entities. Now, you've probably all seen this before. Whenever you want to use an ampersand symbol in HTML, you're probably going to escape it like this, right? So you type ampersand AMP and then followed by a semicolon. And note here that the semicolon ends the character reference. And you know, semicolon can be really a mischievous character. It causes a lot of problems in programming languages like JavaScript. Even in CSS, it can cause trouble. And an example of this is this GitHub issue against the Twitter Bootstrap library. At some point, they had a JavaScript file which was missing an optional semicolon. So it wasn't actually missing. The JavaScript was executing just fine. But as soon as you try to minify this JavaScript file using a very specific JavaScript minifier, you know, the minifier would kind of explode and it wouldn't work and it would break. Now, there was a user who filed this bug against the Twitter Bootstrap library, and the maintainer said, okay, fair enough, but this is not really a bug on our end. It's a bug in the minifier. And then the next reply is by Douglas Crockford, who made that minifier, who broke, and he said, and I'm going to quote here, "That is insanely stupid code. I'm not going to dumb down JSMin, the minifier, for this case." Now, needless to say, this was on the internet, so a little while later, there were over 280 comments in this thread, and it's kind of funny to think about that, because in the end, they were all arguing about this single semicolon. Now, I think the problem with semicolons in general is that in many languages, they appear to be optional, but in reality, they're not. And there are a lot of Ruby programmers here. Maybe they don't have that problem, but you know, if you've ever written JavaScript before or CSS, you know that this is the case. And what surprised me here is that this also applies to JavaScript. You know, even in JavaScript, semicolons can cause problems, or omitting semicolons at least can cause that. So getting back to our previous example, in this case, again, if you're that kind of person, you can get away with omitting a semicolon if you really want to. The only difference is that now your code is suddenly invalid HTML. And you know how I feel about HTML validation. It's not 100% necessary, but if the only thing holding you back is one semicolon, maybe you should just add it, you know. Another reason not to use this trick is because it's really confusing, especially if you use it in an attribute value. You will find that it gets parsed completely differently. Attribute values have different parsing rules. So in this case, the title will render as foo ampersand AMP bar, but the text will render as foo ampersand bar instead. So that's another reason not to do this. You know, even if you don't like semicolons, they're just necessary to avoid this kind of weird bugs. Now, the thing that really surprised me here about the ampersand character reference is that in some cases, in a lot of cases actually, you can get away with not escaping it at all. You can just use the raw character. For example, here, it's followed by a space, and that is perfectly valid code, and it will render reliably on all browsers. Now, if you want to find out the exact rules here, I'm not going to bore you with all those details, but if you do care about that stuff, read the link at the bottom, and there you can find all of it. Another example is this one, the greater than symbol. It has a special meaning in HTML, of course, because we use it to close tags that have been opened before. So if you want to use it, you can escape it using &GT semicolon. And the same thing goes here. You can omit the semicolon. Now, this is not true for all possible character references. There's a restrictive list for which this trick works, where you can actually omit the semicolon and have it still work, even though it's invalid. And this is another one of those. But still, I think it's a really bad idea to do this for the same reasons as before. It's just really confusing, especially if you mix it with attribute values, where they get treated completely differently. But again, what surprised me here is that in a lot of cases, actually in most cases, you can get away with not encoding the greater than symbol at all in HTML. So this is perfectly valid HTML code, and it will render reliably in all browsers. And the reason is that the browser knows that unless you're opening a tag and you want to close it, this character probably doesn't have any special meaning. It knows that you just want to use the raw character instead. So that's why this works. The only reason you would ever have to escape this in HTML is if you're using it as part of an unquoted attribute value. But you shouldn't use unquoted attribute values. Now, another weird thing that I only recently found out about is this. So let's say you have a character reference based on a number. That happens a lot. So what symbol is this, and how will it render in a browser? Now, usually you take a look at the reference, and here you see that it says x85. The x means that it's a hexadecimal number that is followed. So the 8 and the 5 are hexadecimal digits. Then you can go and look in the Unicode standard, look up the code point 00085, and that gives you this character, which happens to be some weird and unused control character. It's probably invisible, or it renders as this nice question mark, maybe. So let's see what it looks like if you render this in HTML, because you actually get a different result, apparently. In HTML, you get a completely different character instead. So it's right between the foo and the bar. There's our reference, and we get a completely different character, as you can see, with a completely different code point as well. Now, let's try the same thing in an XHTML document, with the proper headers and everything. And there, as you can see, the correct character is used because we don't see anything special between the foo and the bar. So this little bit of HTML has completely different behavior in XHTML versus in regular HTML. So what's going on there? What's causing this? Well, it turns out that the HTML spec has a list of these special numbers, and if you use a character reference for any of those numbers, it turns out they map to completely different symbols than the ones you would expect to. Like in this case, x85 maps to the horizontal ellipses that we saw earlier. And the difference with XHTML is that XHTML is based on XML, which doesn't have this list, and has slightly different rules in this aspect. So that's why we have a difference there. I thought that was kind of weird. Now let's talk about tags and elements for a little bit in HTML. So this is a fairly simple HTML document. I'm using the HTML5 doc type, but what I'm about to say applies to HTML4 or even HTML2 if you want to. What really surprised me here is that you can just get away with omitting the end tags for these elements. So for both head, HTML, and body, you can just drop them, and then you end up with this document instead. And it's still perfectly valid, and it will still render exactly the same way in all browsers. And then what really surprised me is that you can also just omit the star tags for these elements. And then just remove this as well, and move that as well, and then you have just this, just a doc type and a title, and maybe some content if you want. And this is still perfectly valid HTML, and it still renders exactly the same way as all the other examples. Now, on that note, well, it's important to know that the head and the HTML and the body elements, they are still there in the DOM. So you can still style them using CSS, and you can still access them using JavaScript and interact with them if you want to. The browser will automatically create them, even if you don't have the tags there in your source code. That's very important to know. So on that note, this is probably the most useless tattoo ever. Because, I mean, if you're going to get an HTML tattoo, at least pick some tags that aren't optional or implied, And similarly, this tweet, of course, I'm taking this completely out of context, but this tweet is rather misinformed. It says HTML head and body is all the HTML you ever really need, but this would be a better version, because those are all the tags that you never really need. You know, the browser doesn't care about them. What you do need is a doc type, probably, if you want standards mode, and a title element. Oh well. Now, that previous example got me thinking, how minimal can we get? You know, how small can we make an HTML document while still having it be something useful or something that shows something on the screen? So I decided to make this little demo. Now, it doesn't look like much special. It's probably just a paragraph or a title, I don't know, with some CSS applied to it. It's not even pretty, so what's going on there? Well, if you look at the HTML source code for this page, you'll see this. It's just completely empty. And I'm not using any weird tricks there to hide the actual source code with white space or something like that. It's actually a completely empty HTML document. So what is going on there? How did I manage to get some text to show there and to style it with CSS? Well, this is what's going on. There's this link HTTP header that you can use, and it is supposed to be a replacement for the link element in HTML. So anything that you can do in your head element in HTML with a link element technically can be done with this HTTP header as well. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm just sending a completely empty HTML document. You can see it there. The content length is 0, so I'm not cheating in any way. And then instead of using HTML to add a CSS file to my page, I just use the HTTP header instead. Now, the only problem with this is that it only works in old Opera, so Opera 12, and in Firefox. All other browsers don't support this. Maybe they will someday, but I'm not really sure. So if you want to view this demo, try it in Firefox at the moment, or get a very old copy of Opera and install it. So this is how I got the text to show up. As we've seen before, even though there's no tags for HTML and body and the head elements, you can still style them in CSS if you want to, and you can use JavaScript if you want to. So to get the background there, I use the HTML element that the browser automatically creates anyway. I also use the body element that the browser creates for me, and then to get the content to show up, I use the CSS content property. Yeah, sorry for the people who are sitting at the back, but it's right there. So there you have it. That's a completely empty HTML document using only CSS to show some stuff on the screen. Of course, don't do this at home. Don't ever use this on a production website. But I thought it was an interesting demo. OK, let's talk about font family names in CSS. For a long time, whenever there was white space in a font family name that I wanted to use, like the beautiful Comic Sans MS font, my personal favorite, I figured it must be wrapped in quotes, else my CSS would be invalid. Because I actually got this off the CSS validator. So the validator is to blame for this mantra that it taught me. It took me years to find out that this is actually not true. If you want to figure out all the exact rules here, you can go to that link there. But the short version is, as long as the font family name is a space-separated set of CSS identifiers, you can omit the quotes, and it's perfectly fine. It's valid CSS, and it works reliably anywhere. In fact, there are much more dangerous things in font family names that can be much more problematic. For example, let's say you have a font family name, a font that's called 456 Beria Street. Now, because this starts with a digit, it's not a valid CSS identifier. So this line of CSS, while it may look harmless, it's actually invalid, and it won't work. It won't do anything. So there are several ways to fix this. You can escape the identifier so that it becomes valid, and then it looks like this. So instead of 456 Beria Street, we now have 3456 Beria Street, and there's this weird space in between, and what's with the backslash? It's a bit weird. So another way to fix this is just to wrap it in quotes anyway. And that solves the problem. It's still valid CSS, and it will avoid you a lot of headaches. So the bottom line is, don't wrap your font family names in quotes just because they contain spaces, because spaces are totally harmless. But if you ever run into a problem, wrap them in quotes anyway. I also created a very useful tool where you can enter any font family name that you want to use, and then it will tell you if it's valid or not to use it with or without quotes. Yay. Now, another thing I'd like to talk about is attribute values in HTML and CSS. So here's a very simple example. You probably know that in CSS you can select elements based on their attribute values, like as you can see here. So we have an A element in HTML, and then use CSS to select that element and give it a nice, beautiful, hot pink background. Now, in this case, you can get away with omitting the quotes, both in HTML and in CSS, as you can see here. And this is still perfectly valid. This still works perfectly fine. And, you know, it feels like walking around naked in your house. Like when you omit the quotes, all of a sudden, sometimes it can feel good, but it can also cause a lot of problems if you're not careful. And yeah, so the thing is, what you need to watch out for is that the rules for unquoted attributes are completely different in CSS than they are in HTML. So if we change the example slightly, as you can see here, here the HTML is completely valid and it will do what you expect it to, but the CSS is actually invalid and the entire rule set will be ignored completely. So the solution here is very simple, just use the damn quotes. So again, there's a bunch of rules for this, and like I said, they differ for HTML and for CSS. And of course, if you want to use a CSS selector in JavaScript, there's an extra level of escaping that you need to do. So there's like 3 sets of rules that you need to keep in mind. So my advice would be to just quote all those attribute values. It avoids a lot of problems. Now, if you don't want to quote them, I created another one of those extremely useful tools where you can just enter any value you want, and it will tell you if it's a valid unquoted attribute value in both HTML and CSS. And as you can see, in some cases, the result is different for the 2 languages. And another thing I'd like to talk about is handling user input. And this is really a quick tip, but it's kind of weird because it took me years to realize this. And the best way to explain this is by having you all just take your laptop or your smartphone and open a demo page that I created. I have a small video here as well, but really this is something that you cannot really see. It's more something you feel. So if you can, open the link there at the bottom. It's mths.be/bqv. So what I have here is 3 different input fields. And I'm using different JavaScript event listeners for each field. And whenever you enter something in the field and the event listener fires, I will copy the value in that field to the rectangle you see there below. So I'm going to start the video now, but again, this is really something that you should be trying for yourself if you can. So here, I'm going to start typing in the key up field. Yeah, I'm typing, but you can't really tell from the video, but it feels like there's a bit of a delay there. And that makes sense, because the event I'm using is key up. It only fires when you lift your finger off the key. And by that time, you know, it feels too late. It feels really slow. And there's some other problems with this approach. Like, for example, if the user holds down the key and enters it repeatedly, the event won't fire, because it will only fire when he lifts his finger off the key. Also, if you paste into the input field without using the keyboard, by right-clicking, for example, there's no keyboard event that will fire, so still the event won't fire. That's the problem. Now, you can make it a little bit faster by using key down. It feels a bit more responsive, because whenever the user puts his finger down on a key, it will fire. But this has the problem that sometimes you miss some characters, because the event only fires as soon as you start typing the next character. And of course, the same things apply here. If you drag text, if you input text by dragging, or if you copy text without using the keyboard, it won't fire at all. So this is still not perfect. Now, luckily, there's a very easy solution for all those problems. You can just use the input element, the input event, as you can see there. So this is what we're going to try now. And you know, it feels really fast and responsive. And it works even if you paste text or cut text away, or if you drag text, or if you hold down a key, it will fire for every character that gets added to the input. So this is exactly what we want. So really, you know, the main message here is to stop using key up and key down for this sort of thing. You don't need them. Input is much better, and it is an event that is supported in all modern browsers anyway, so you don't need to worry about backwards compatibility too much. Okay. Someone's getting a phone call in the first few rows. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so another thing I spent some time researching is characters in JavaScript. So JavaScript strings. You know, whenever you use JavaScript or any programming language, it's very likely that you'll be dealing with strings somehow, right? Well, how would you count the number of characters or symbols in a string in JavaScript? My first thought would be to use the length property, because in a lot of cases it seems to match. Like if you have a string with a capital letter A in there, and you take the length off of it, the result is 1, which makes sense. And you can explain this by using escape sequences to represent all the symbols in the string. As you can see on the second line, you can see that there's only one escape sequence needed for this character, so it makes sense that the length is 1. The same thing goes for the capital letter B. It has a length of 1, as we would expect. However, if you use slightly different characters, for example, as you can see here, the mathematical bold capital letter A in Unicode, it actually has a length of 2, even though there's only a single symbol there. So, of course, it can be explained, kind of, because if you write down that string using nothing but escape sequences, you can see that you need 2 escape sequences just to represent a single character. And these escape sequences are called surrogate pairs. So they're a pair, so together they form only a single symbol. And this is really annoying and crazy, and because we're human beings and we see strings in terms of symbols and Unicode characters, we don't want to deal with this underlying encoding madness. So just to give you an idea of how this underlying encoding madness works, here are some formulas to calculate the surrogate pairs based on a given code point for a symbol, and the other way around. You don't need to remember all this, of course, but apparently if you want to use strings in JavaScript, this is something you should know, which is kind of weird. This really, really surprised me. Now, a better solution to our question, to the problem we had before, if we want to count the number of characters in a string, would be something like this, where you would account for those surrogate pairs, and each pair would just count as a single symbol. You can use the Punicode.js library for that, which ships with Node.js, so it's just built in. You don't need to install anything. And then it has a utility method called UCS2decode. You just pass the string in there, and then you get the resulting array that contains 1 code point for each symbol in the string. So if you just get the length of that array afterwards, that gives you a more accurate result. It's still not perfect. There are some weird Unicode characters that visually look like they're just a single character, but then actually there are 700, for example. You can account for those cases, but that's for another presentation, maybe. Now, another thing I was looking into was JavaScript variable names, and really there are no words to explain how this works. So I decided to do a little quiz instead. So which of these lines do you think is invalid? Yeah, well, who thinks it's the first one? Show of hands. Yeah, okay, there's some weird stuff going on there, indeed. What's the second one? Who thinks it's the second one? No? Who thinks it's the third one? Who thinks it's the fourth one? There's like plus and minus and some other operators in there. Who thinks it's the last one? Okay, you got me. Yeah, there's a 0-width num-breaking space right after the A symbol there, so that's the only invalid one. I could try to explain the rules to you, but instead I'll just give you this handy regular expression that summarizes all the rules for valid JavaScript variable names according to Unicode 6.3.0 and ECMAScript 5.1. So for those of you taking notes, good luck. Yeah, copyright issues though. So again, I made another really useful tool where you can enter any string, and it will tell you if it's a valid variable name in JavaScript. So for example, you can use the look of disapproval inside your try-catch variables, which I think is kind of nice. And it maybe seems a little bit useless, but I managed to find lots of bugs in pretty much any existing JavaScript engine out there, and meanwhile they have all been fixed. So it's a lot of fun building these tools, and even if there's no direct use for them. So with that, that's it for me. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.